Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. 200! We are here! 200 videos! Don't know how I've managed it. Particularly recently, considering I've had to do a lot of catching up due to the gaps in my schedule. But yes, finally, 200 videos, 200 films. Wow, yes, it is... It's really nice to have reached this point within the process. I did want to acknowledge the halfway point, which would have been about 182. But I felt that considering how close the 200 was, it would be nicer to do a video or do a event video marking the 200th more. And so I couldn't think of a better film than to do the classic, the cinema-defining Psycho. And, of course, the problem I create for myself by wanting to address Psycho and discuss it. Because, frankly, as I've said for many of the classics that I've covered, the Criterion collection that I have covered over the previous months and weeks and months, it is very hard to discuss one of the most talked about films that has been analysed and studied and deciphered. Like, what possibly could I have more to say about this film? And I don't, so thank you for joining me. If you like this video, no. I mean, it is interesting. I definitely on this viewing of the film wanted to try and approach it from a different tack. Because, of course, like everyone else, I've watched this with the weight of history, the weight of cultural context, of cinema history and genre definition, all on the shoulders of this film. You know, I've read and watched and discussed all of the aspects about, you know, how the film was formed, Alfred Hitchcock's vision, the influence that it had, you know, the fact that it is counted as a horror film. As I've said before, you know, if you look at the sort of seminal 5 horror films, it is counted as one of them, even though it's barely horror. It's not, it is horror just about, horror adjacent. It sort of walks the line between dark, twisted thriller and horror, and I know that's an incredibly small gap to sort of stand in, but that's where it is, that's where it belongs, because it's not, you know, it's not horror in the same way as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's definitely not horror in the same way as things like Alien or The Exorcist. It is more of a thriller, psychological character study that just shocked people and horrified them because, again, nothing like this had ever been done before. You know, cinema like this didn't exist. And of course I've watched it with you know, all of that expectation upon it. This viewing, I really wanted to try and look at it through the eyes of people who would have seen it at the time. You know, the idea that, of course, everyone would have known at this point who Alfred Hitchcock, well, not everyone, but cinema goers would know the name Alfred Hitchcock. He was already a famed director. Shelley Lee, see, I had this problem earlier. I said Janet Lee was a recognised actress. Anthony Perkis is known from working with Alfred, but again, it's you know, people wouldn't have gone in going, okay, you know, they wouldn't have gone in watching this knowing that it is going to be a seminal piece of filmmaking. They would have gone in going, it is another Alfred Hitchcock. The beauty of watching Rope from a few months ago is the fact that, you know, that's probably the kind of narrative people went in to expect. You know, very much more like Rear Window, Northwest, you know, much more clear-cut stories that you know, Alfred Hitchcock was pushing the boundaries in terms of murder mysteries, thrillers, character studies, but this is the next level. This is him pushing every possible boundary that he could. And so I imagine going in as the first time viewer in the 60s, sitting down to watch this, and immediately it's trying to shock and upset your, what would have been the sensibilities of the time. I mean, it opens with Marion Crane and Sam, post-coital, or at least waking up from the morning of, after having a night of coitus, with her in her underwear, which, again, was shocking for that time. That wasn't done. And the idea that Hitchcock happily just jumped straight into doing that, again, demonstrated in a subtle way that he was intending for this film to be shocking, to upset people. In the same way that, you look at, like, Kubrick's... Is it Kubrick who did Lolita? Yes, it is. That's a mad film to do. The idea that Kubrick went in and decided to try and make this incredibly difficult, controversial, disturbing film. And yet, that was almost like the challenge. In the same way, Hitchcock clearly wanted to make a film that people would go away and talk about and be upset by, and would of course cause controversy for him, because what is cinema if not pushing boundaries? And so something as simple as that to open with. And again, it's that interesting thing that, obviously now the twist that the character you think is your lead is killed off halfway through is discussed infinitum, is something that has been done many, many times. But of course, this is, as I say, seminal. This is not the first time it was done in a major mainstream context, and Hitchcock's works were very theatrical, and there isn't, in theatre it's unlikely that you would kill off your lead partway through, not only because, again, storytelling wise, it's just not a common story beat, but also because you would have your actors, and what do you do with an actor? If you have your lead actor killed off halfway through a stage production, I mean, you could have them play something else, but and Hitchcock was known for, a lot of his work came from a more theatrical tradition. But again, even in terms of cinema and sort of the beats of cinema, this idea of having a character who was, it wasn't just that she was the lead, it's that the camera was fixed on her perspective. She wasn't like the lead in the lead amongst an ensemble. This was the story of Marion Crane. And it's interesting, again, going in thinking, what would someone think this film is going to be about? Assuming, and again, this is a bias, I suppose, but I imagine the way, I've seen Alfred Hitchcock's trailer for Psycho, but assuming that most people wouldn't have gone in having seen that, or if they had, still not being 100% sure what they think this film's going to be, the idea that you obviously follow Marion, and of course she goes from having this illicit relationship to deciding to rob this $40,000. And all of a sudden you're sort of following different scenes and characters, and the beauty of it is the uncertainty. At least from my perspective, obviously being someone who knows what the film's going to be about, but trying to think, okay, what if I didn't? You have the scene with her boss and her colleague, the other secretary, and the guy, and I look at that scene and I think, I imagine someone watching this thinking, well, these are main characters? They go to great lengths to establish the other secretary. The fact that, they're talking about the drugs, the fact that Mariam's not feeling 100%, and obviously that's stress-related due to the decisions that she's currently culminating in her mind, but her colleague goes off on one about, the tranquilizers she took around the time of her marriage, and the sort of implications of this woman's relationship to narcotics, or the guy whose money it is, Casey, who of course is this rootin' tootin', overly drunk, arrogant, sexist, just all round like unlikable guy, and you're thinking, and you look at him and you think, how does his character work in the grand scheme of things? Now, as it transpires, both of those are both two characters who don't get a lot of play after their scene. The boss, though there's not much more to say about him, again, he does have a little bit more to do, but not a great deal more. And then, of course, once you have the theft, and you're following different characters picking up, the police officer who pulls her over, the trader, the used car dealer who's constantly speaking. You're thinking, how will these characters play in? What's their function? And of course, you come back to the Psycho title, and again, I was discussing colloquially with producer wife Helen about the idea of, well, was Psycho something that people would use at the time as would people know what that meant? Generally speaking, to do with psychopaths and serial killers and murderers, and of course that being a misunderstanding of the use of the term, but in terms of pop culture knowledge, and it is strange because it's like, well, no film like this had ever been made before, and obviously people would have heard of psychopaths, but would it have that same, that same sort of, the word have that same meaning? And it is interesting because, again, you're following Mariam. And, of course, as an audience member going in, the assumption would have to be that Mariam is a psychopath. And watching it from that perspective, of course, especially when she's in the car, and you have the scenes in voiceover playing out of her boss talking to police. Oh no, her boss talking to the guy whose money she stole. The policeman talking to the car dealer, and you're thinking, are these scenes that are playing out in reality? Are they playing out just in her mind? Or is it a little bit of both? Is she being paranoid, or is her fears founded? Because of course she is committing a major crime. And it's interesting, of course, because once I looked at it like that, you of course parallel the shot of her with her face very still, pensive, almost tortured, whilst she hears these voices in her head. And of course you parallel that with the ending, where of course you have Norman, whose face is twisted in a joyous grimace as he hears one clear voice in his head, and you think, oh, that is an interesting thematic parallel between where Mariam was and where Norman ends up. But of course, as I say, at the time, that only further... If you get to that point in the film, you would assume, oh, well, this is a further indication that she is the psychopath, and that her mind is cracking, and we're going to see her over the course of the film break down. And of course that's not how it goes at all, because of course she arrives at the Bates Motel. And the beauty of the Bates Motel sequences is, like I say, the whole thing has a certain theatricality to it, but there is something particularly theatrical about their exchange, about the way that it's framed. There's this strange entrapment that you see, of course, because Marion, I've talked a lot, extensively over this series about fatal, and I suppose the old English term would be weird, the idea of destiny, but the tragic destiny of a character who, had no hope of escape. Because, of course, as Mariam tries to sort of flee with the money, you see the trap slowly close upon her, like the forces of nature themselves are driving her to her inevitable destiny with Norman. And there is about sort of the darkness and the rain and the way that the signs sort of draw her towards the place that she needs to get to, because unbeknownst to her, destiny has decided that she will be the ultimate victim. Because I suppose on some level she is the ultimate victim. It's interesting because, as I said, this film is about sensibilities and upsetting them. And the idea is, this character who, as I say, people would have been watching this thinking, so she's the psychopath. You see her being sort of sexually parading herself, which, of course, in the 60s would have been shocking and very unacceptable. Because, of course, female sexuality didn't exist before the 1970s, but, and the idea that, of course, she decides to commit a crime of passion, a crime that she wants does for love, but a crime. And, you have that sense at that point where, it's like, well, either we were going to follow the path of a criminal, or we were going to see someone get their quote-unquote just desserts. And, of course, there is something disturbing about that. And I wonder whether audiences would have felt conflicted. The idea that, like with many, and again, theatrical characters from particularly sort of Russian theatre traditions, if you had a female lead, often her story, like The Doll's House, I suppose, is the one that comes to my mind, and the idea that your female lead will eventually be caught up by her own deceitful, sinful ways, and it will destroy her. And that traditionally that normally meant one of two things, either ruin or suicide, whereas in this case, it sort of pushes that boundary where it's now about someone who, did a socially unacceptable thing, well, a crime, but, and also is socially unacceptable. And yet, it means that she is driven to the hands of an awaiting monster. And whether audiences would have been distressed because they would have felt conflicted. On the one hand, she got her just desserts. On the other hand, what happened to her is horrifying. And that whole balance between, that the horror of how she is killed and the and like I say, the sense of justice because she didn't get away with doing her crime or being a woman who's sexually active, and it's and it complicates things, and I think that is definitely something Hitchcock wanted to represent through this. And of course we get to the infamous shower. Sorry, before that, and then of course we have the sense of she's driven to the base motel. We have the scene with Norman, and then there is that tragic thing about the rain stopping, and the fact is that it was the rain and the dark that drove her there, and it's the idea that once she gets to that point and has no intention, she may as well stay the night. That she is, that because her fate has been sealed at that point. Additionally, I was considering the sort of nature of tragedy, and of course, good tragedy is is often about the decisions made and what would have happened if decisions had gone differently. And of course, you have the moment when Norman invites Mariam to dinner. And I was thinking, as that scene played out, I was thinking, if she had not accepted his invitation, would she have been spared? Because of course he is triggered by sexual desire, but was that something that triggered him from the beginning of when she arrived, or only during the dinner scene, at which point the mother personality comes out and kills her? If she had refused his offer, would that have been the thing that would have, would she have gotten away from him? The nature of tragedy is the fact that you don't know. It's the Othello handkerchief. It's that sense of maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe no matter what would have happened, that mother would have still murdered Mariam. She already, as it said at the end, he's already killed 2 other women. So it's not as if this is the first time, and it might be a minor event that causes mother to come out, as I say, sexually driven. And so of course you get to the famous shower scene. There isn't a lot to say about it. The only thing that occurred to me as I was watching it was the fact that I was wondering whether Mariam knew, from the audience's perspective, Norman mother is silhouetted, and yet I wonder. Obviously, that is for the purposes of the story and for the audience, so that we do not know the identity of the mother. But of course, it's perspective based, so we have to assume we're seeing through the eyes of Mariam. But part of me does wonder, on another level, does she know who kills her? Does she know that it is? Does she realise in her final moments that it is? Does she think it's mother, or does she realise that it is Norman, a disturbed Norman? Again, it's just so interesting, sort of different perceptions of how that scene plays out. I mean, there is a possibility that she never even, being hacked to death in a shower, she might not even have had the time to consider that. But again, it's interesting, and of course, producer wife Helen noted something else, which is, of course, you actually, as the shower curtain is pulled across, you see the eyes of the killer, and I think that's, again, of course, a really interesting stroke. And of course, the funny thing about Psycho is everything up to that point is very famous, but after that, it's funny the things that I had forgotten, and sort of what happens until you get to the big climactic ending. For instance, the Abergast stuff, almost completely had forgotten about it. I'd forgotten he is another victim. And I did remember sort of later on, I went, oh no, there was a man who was killed. But watching his investigation and how that all plays out, it was weird. I genuinely had forgotten that he goes there, is investigating, and is killed because of his investigations. Because, again, it's not them, at that point it's not as interesting, it's not as overly complicated as there's not a lot to sort of dig into. He is just simply collateral. And it's interesting other things, like the fact that Lila steps in to the place of Mariam. But it is interesting about how Lila, other than being the concerned sister, we never really know a lot about her. There isn't time to learn a lot about her. And it's interesting that, you get her and Sam and their dynamic, of course, Sam being Mariam's lover and Lila being Mariam's sister. And again, it's interesting to sort of read into what their relationship is, now both having to sort of quote unquote work together to discover Mariam's fate. And again, perhaps this isn't the watch through that I feel like I had answers from that, but it's an interesting thing to read into, to go, well, what is their chemistry here? Do they like each other? Do they not like each other? Is this a sort of a relationship of necessity? Who's to say? Did they have a previous relationship before Mariam's death? Did they know who each other were? Again, it's not elaborated upon. It is a little, but not in great detail. But yeah, and then of course you get to the big denouement, the big revelation of Norman and the mother and the body, and it is, again, it's understandable why it is considered horror, and of course it is completely understandable why that turning of the skull, the body, and of course the showing Norman dressed as mother. It's all so chaotic and manic, and absolutely would have disturbed people of the time. It's disturbing now, the way it's framed and structured, and sort of the shock factor of it. But at the time, of course, it would have been revelatory. And then, of course, you have the very strange, very unfortunate ending of the psychologist having to explain Norman's condition, and it's necessary, I suppose, because nothing like this had ever been shown before, and an explanation was needed. But again, as I said with Fear Street, horror is better in the ambiguous. And although it actually doesn't neutralise too much of the horror that came before, the explanation definitely feels more in the wheelhouse of Hitchcock mysteries. The idea of someone going, oh well, this is what it is, this is the explanation, here's everything tied up. Which is why I'm thankful then, of course, it is followed up by the final monologue, which again is just great. And Anthony Perkins, whose career, stayed on a steady track, but he wasn't a huge name other than in this, because he gives such a good, nuanced performance. I mean, that ending, the way he smiles is, it's a disturbing picture to be left with. But even the scene when he's talking to Mariam, in his rooms, and the way that he knows, as an actor, how to shift the power dynamic. That when he sat back, he's submissive. When he sat forward, he's he's in control. And so the idea that sort of this is the conflict of Norman. That perhaps when he sits forward, he's Mother. When he sits back, he's Norman. And that sort of very subtle takes shows, the careful consideration he puts into the character work. This is Psycho. This is one of the greatest films ever made. I can't recommend you watch it because, again, it's one of the greatest films ever made. As soon as you see the title, you should go, oh yeah, Psycho. I either have seen this or should have seen this. It is, I'll say a third time, one of the greatest films ever made. Please go and watch it if you didn't watch it before this video. Again, I don't know if any of my musings on this one particularly add to the conversation about this legendary film, but again, it was fun to take my 200th and use it to discuss something that I think is just a groundbreaking film. I don't know, maybe 250 I'll do something a bit more adventurous, maybe a live stream or something else. We'll see. If I get to 250, we'll see how things go. But for now, thank you for joining me. If you like the video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because this will help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my catalogue of 200 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.